We are live early. There we go. Clickety clack, opening logos. Troubles in Paradise, Tortuga and WordPress.com. Yay. There we go. There's our little opening thing. There's been connection issues going up and down on this, so we're just kind of winging it. Jackson's here. He hasn't been able to join the show in quite a while. Connections are weird in Louisiana, so we're just all crossing our fingers here that things be running. So welcome to the Evolution Hour. We're, as usual, giving a blow-by-blow discussion of replacing Darwin, Nathaniel Jeanson's book that has no chance in hell of replacing Darwin. And we're still in the biogeography chapter. And I'll also be giving a immediate thank you for our patrons, because just in case the signal screws up on here, well, let me switch back over to, there we go. Oh, we need to actually, I thought I had a thing where we were allowed, where we could mix our people in. Okay, that's better. I'm perfectly happy having your mug up there. I thought we had a thing where we could share the image on here.
You should. It should be
I'm
right
not
under
sure
your
about
screen.
that. Anyway, let me thank our patrons. Yeah, it's there should have been a little menu there where I can click. Hello, we got some people. Slade, hello, Slade. We're starting early, just because of the eccentricity of the internet. Let me thank the patrons, just in case we lose contact. Our colleagues, Hendril, Colton, Eric Riley, Soros, and Zeshi. Our researcher level, Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Speed of Sound. Our assistant researchers, Duranku, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson. Our friends, Daniel, Steve Bauman, Marydale Meadows, Insects Are Cool, Devin Reeves, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffle Loveliness, Bo Rasmussen, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams. And our legacy patrons, Jen and Jody and Mike, John, Keith, Andrew Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nanya, Steigel, Sun, Skystone, Douglas Drummond, Truls, Everett, and Sewer, all of you who have helped the project in one capacity or another. I thank you a great deal on all of that. So, Brian says, hello. Slade says, how's it going? Muddling along here. It's snowing in Spokane, so after the show is over, I'm going to be schlepping snow off the walkway and trying to clear snow berms and so forth and so on. Although the temperature is supposed to go up into the 40s and that, which will clear a lot of the material away. I'd already gone out and done chopping and stuff before the snowfall hit, and so that was relatively easy to tinker with. So there we go. And we will discuss the fact that we have shameless plugs. The Paralogs of Phileas Fogg, the Rocks Were There with Jackson, and also Evolution Slam Dunk on the reptile mammal transition that you can get and add as wonderful books to give to people you can't stand who are creationists, or people that you definitely like who are evolutionists, and they're real thick and wonderful, and so forth and so on. I'm almost finished with the second Paralogs novel. I was just wrangling over how would a fellow knock over a cane successfully in such a way as not suspicious? That was a little plot point in the little story on there. But anyway, that's a weird side digression. The biogeography stuff in Jeanson's book at this stage, first of all, he doesn't cite a damn bit of technical literature anywhere in it. He lists off stuff from Encyclopedia Britannica and state websites as to how many animals are there or what the area of the state is. I mean, it's really generic. And he at one point brought up the Galapagos. Well, okay. If he's not going to bring up any technical literature, I will. So I've got some links that I'll be putting up in the feed after we get this on the geology of how the islands formed, the biogeographical data of why the particular forms of life end up there, and a cute little paper from 2009 on the lava lizards and the implications of how they colonized the place and all of that. And all of this involving millions of years. If Jeanson had wanted to discuss it and grapple with the data field and offer his detailed creationist version, fine, but that's not what he's doing. And so way down the road in the chapter 10, apparently he will be getting around down to making claims that are the meat of the book, which is effectively virtually all current species have originated since the flood. That's his argument. And that's going to be really good. Oh, Slade says just 40 degree condition are going. Yes, 40 is pretty warm. That's significantly more. I'll take, when I was talking 40 degrees, I was talking 40 degrees Fahrenheit. None of this namby-pamby metric stuff. As opposed to 40 degrees Kelvin, which is just a little nippy for everybody. If it's 40 degrees Kelvin, kids, do not go outside, bundle up. And at that point, it's just a little bit there. You can take, well, I know it's not quite cold enough to freeze helium.
Well,
degrees Kelvin.
if it's 40 degrees Kelvin, you're getting down to the point where atoms are going slower than normal.
Yeah. And speaking of slower than normal, the creationist brain of Gunter Bechly.
That was a segue.
Yeah, that's a cold burn. The other portion of the material that I'll be posting online once we get the show scheduled has to do with a recent posting that Gunter Bechly from the Discovery Institute, their in-house pet paleontologist, has done dissing Ediacaran paleontology. He really doesn't like the idea that things are going on evolutionary during that period, and it happens that a giant block of the technical literature that he's bouncing into is open access. So it's going to be a pile of links to these various papers. And I invite everybody to read Gunter Bechly's Evolution News Post and then read the technical papers and find that, gosh, it's an interesting period that's going on here. And let's see, one of the there's thing on Ediacaran ecosystems. Even at one point alluded to a 2015 paper by Michael Benton on systematics. And mammal evolution has been really well resolved. And this was probably another one that why are you bringing this up, Gunter? This is not helping you any. And there's a paper from 2017 on Ediacaran extinction, and then another one that Bechly didn't cite from 2017 on the ecology of juvenile forms that are seen in the Ediacaran system. So it'll be just, you can start off the new year, or if you're really a glutton for punishment, you could spend your New Year's Eve reading about Ediacaran biota. Yeah. And so all of that stuff will be put in the main field. Before the show came on the air, Jackson and I were jibber-jabbering back and forth on some of the various interactions that we've been experiencing over the last weeks or so amongst creationists. Jackson had a wonderful discussion on phylogeny with Fazal Rana. Perhaps you'd like to summarize that for the audience.
Oh yeah, it was a fun discussion where we didn't really have a model. RJ just dropped off.
No, I put you up on the screen.
Oh, okay. Whew. You scared me for a second there. Yeah, basically it was just he didn't have a model, and so every time I asked him, well, do you think these two things are related? He would say, well, I don't really know.
Yeah.
And 50 minutes of that. If you want to watch that, go ahead.
Yeah, it's exactly what I expected was not going to happen with Rana, because Rana has no systematics. The issue of here's all the different critters that have lived over time. And remember, he's an older creationist, so this is the standard time frame we're talking about. Every single one of these little critters existed in time. Well, what happened? Are any of them related to anything else? If they're not related to anything else, well, that's a creation event, right? Is it is it a created kind, and then stuff is coming off of that? You would think that you would have that little thinking cap that you would put on that go, ooh, let me look at the data field and let me apply my carefully worked out notion of what it means to be a created kind or a created organism and work out the systematics of life in that older creationist frame. We have hit a snag. They don't have a model. They don't actually have a notion of what creation means. And the intelligent designers are in exactly that same boat. So one of the things that I've been putting up as a litmus test item is to ask a creationist, is anything related to anything? And if so, on what basis? And we're not able to get that in any way, shape, or form on here. Oh, Slade says she saw that the conversation. Yes, it was an interesting little thing to deal with.
Yep.
And in our off hours, we do interact with an awful lot of people on collecting a lot of points to keep things up to speed on so many technical issues, keep track of what creationists are doing, the peanut gallery that goes on with Standing for Truth's Brain Trust and all that stuff. That's at lower echelon, but then also the ones higher up on the field, the actual creationist material and what's coming up on that. Because you want to see where they are in not applying their model too much, and to see what is occurring with other organisms. Oh, hello, old Scratch. Yeah, we got another one in here. Change over time. No alleles here. That would make me transitional. Yes, that's indeed. And so the one issue is, okay, with anything, this is beyond just creationism. This is a general source methods issue. That any model you work out, you need to clarify what it is you have with the data field. You have to be actively curious to want to explain the data field. That's why you have a model, isn't it? It's that you have a notion and you're trying to apply it to things, and then show by the immense power and persuasiveness and comprehensivity of your model that you can overpower and convince your opponents, and then you can make some headway on that. And Jackson is not visible on the screen. I don't think his head is nodding and all of that.
Oh.
There was an option for a little window down in the side, and I can't figure out why that is not showing up on this. But it's just weird
I have no
why we
idea.
can't be able to have that, because it's whether or not. Let me test around. Oh, there we go. I like that. There we go. There you can be, because you're. Oh, see what the hell? Why is that shifting
I don't
along
know.
in there? I don't know. Anyway, so long as that will work that way, they can see both of us at the same time, and your clever reaction shots can be poking up and visible in the thing. But it's an ongoing process that goes on. We're building gradually a network of people, and anybody that else knows of people in this that have an interest in defending science. They dislike creationism or in its various iterations and have expertise in areas. It can be in anything from visualizations of things, graphic arts, as well as technical literature or particular things, like Dan Stern Cardinale is an actual professor, so he's got cred. Erica Gutzik-Gibbon, who is marvelous on primates. We've got Colton, who in geology, Steve Bauman, who supports the channel and the Patreon, geology. And so we've got building up a network. We want to bring in people that are connecting up into cosmology, in other areas of paleontology, invertebrates, and all that. And of course, Jackson has got a little degree coming along the line, you little stinker. And I think he's also there. He goes. The screen is moving again. And by this bit, not merely expertise, but armed with that source methods technique of to know the higher level philosophy of things, but to really be familiar with the data field and how to present it effectively, and to know the opponent's position better than they do, and to know what questions to ask in order to reveal the fact that the opponents don't have their model. Hello, Ian. Ian, who is also a supporter of the channel. And a wonderful person for so many different people around here. Gutzik Gibbon and others that you supported their network on there. We got a lot of that. Together, it's amazing what people can do. And because what we're doing right here, electronic, there's going to be people all over the place that can see stuff and they can go mouse click. A thing for everybody that's doing videos, I really recommend. It's not that you can't put just generic links out, but you really ought to be focusing more on putting links that are open access full text. So don't put linkages unless it's a really critical point to where you're saying, well, there's this paper and it's not available open access. Even in some cases, when I've had to do that, I found that there's a good summary of it somewhere. So because it's important enough to bring up, and I can put the summary up, and you can get that. But by and large, I try to restrict things to the things that you can get either as an HTML or a PDF on their websites, which means don't take my word for it. I'm actually inviting you, fact check, look on your own, read on your own, because it's neat shit. It's wonderfully fascinating material. It's the most astonishing. We are living in a time of such a candy store of scientific availability on every possible subject in history as well as the science, archaeology, cosmology, and all of this. How dare anybody not be excited about that? And how dare anybody not know about all that material, so that if somebody comes up and starts saying, well, that geology record isn't really any good. Oh, really? Well, and
Let's talk
come
about
in
it.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so um, if you're a super genius, it can be a polymath on everything. Well, go for it, kid. But if you have specialized interests, then use those strengths. So Erica is just a buzzsaw when she deals with people on hominid issues, because this is her area of expertise. She's not casually interested in it. Dapper Dino and I are both dinosaur geeks. We're amateurs. We're not professional paleontologists, but boy, we like dinosaurs, and we are interested in those. And wild horses will not keep us from understanding everything that we can about all this. And that means that when I went on and had my debate with Mr. Batman on whether there were dinosaurs alive with human beings, and discovered that he knows nothing about dinosaurs, absolute vacuum, that it's wow. You are going to debate somebody on dinosaurs coexisting with people, and you don't have even the modicum of curiosity to know anything about any of them? Whoa, that won't cut it. So everybody get their own area of expertise and specialty, and then make sure of grounding in sound method. There are so many tools out there. Wikipedia, nothing wrong with Wikipedia as a springboard. It can measure lots of things. They've got often very useful summaries of technical things with technical literature that's mentioned, but you can even use them negatively. If you hear of a new animal that's popped down the line, I've seen examples of this on paleontology, and suddenly a name pops up, and you look on Wikipedia, and that listing is really short. It's like, there's a new animal. That's because this hasn't gotten a technical paper written yet. And so that puts a little boundary around it. If you want to follow up on that, do so. But it means that it's something that hasn't quite gelled enough to where it's even got a solid Wikipedia page. And then you can use other things, Google Scholar, Google directly, a thing that I've recommended to everybody. Oh, Slade says, just had a conversation with my dad, a creationist, where he told me the creationist book he started reading. Ooh, what book is that, Slade? Yeah, put that in the chat. I want to know. RJ's curious. RJ's on the thing. This, yeah. I'm definitely anxious to know what exactly that one is, because that there's a whole network, as I've been showing in how I approach this little puppy. Every book is a layer of scholarship. It's got its overt message, the actual text. It's got whatever references are being alluded to, in which case there's little footnotes, and then you look in the back, and there's a listing of the little references that refer to it. And the references may or may not be telling you a hell of a lot. You only find that out when you look up the references. And then there's the meta structure of the book to see how easy it is to get information. So a book without an index is by definition harder to find the information. A book that lacks a reference bibliography means that you don't know what all they cited. You would only encounter the source referencing in the course of their citing it in the footnotes. But that means that if you want to know if they cited the Schmidlap paper from 1985, how do you find that out quickly? Unless there's a reference bibliography and an index. So all of those are cues as to how much a person is wanting to present an argument that's user-friendly, that's fair to the data field, Let's see. She comes up this and up and up and yeah, okay. So keep keep us informed, Slade, if you can find out what the actual book of the title is. Because if it's, for example, Dwayne Gish's Evolution: The Fossils Still Say No, which you would practically have to blow the cobwebs off of. It's from 1995. You could order it easily online. It's still available, and you still find it sold in a lot of creationist bookstores. But that's a quarter of a century ago. She forgets the title. Well, here is where the source methods approach goes into the case, because when you have once you've anchored it in a specific work, then you can interact with people by a network to find out. Ooh, I've heard about that one. Jackson discovered that very thing a couple years ago before we got to do book writing together. When somebody had brought up this old thing on Proto Avis,
RJ,
and
that was 3 years ago. Can you believe that?
yeah, yeah, tell your side of the Proto Avis story, because this is a perfect example of how time can be saved by interconnecting.
So yeah, that was way back right after you appeared on Paleozoic's channel back in 2017, and then we kind of bumped into each other on Twitter. And one of the, I believe it was the Genesis Apologetics YouTube channel. They have all of their videos have the comments turned off because they're very confident about their position.
Yeah,
but they mentioned a bird fossils in the Triassic. And so I asked RJ if he knew anything about that, and of course he did. So
yeah, I already knew about it. It was a thing that Dwayne Gish was making a big deal out of in his old books back in the 1990s. Which how would you know about unless you had Dwayne Gish's books in your personal library?
Right.
You're not going to probably find them. They're not online, so this would be a thing. But I said, oh yeah, that's a so and so argument, and that I'd put a whole section on it in Dinomania. The upshot was that there's this Dockham formation where there are bits and pieces of stuff. It's mudstone for a reason. And Chatterjee, the paleontologist, had talked himself into thinking that what's probably bits and pieces of Herrerasaurus was this Proto-Avis bird from the Triassic. And it's fair to say nobody's taken it seriously. Alan Fiducia didn't take it seriously. That's how flimsy a fossil this was. He was thinking there was nothing to it.
right, and there's
no one's found any corroboration of it since. And it makes perfect sense that Chatterjee still tries to dangle it out there. What's more probable is that at best it may be bits and pieces of a Herrerasaur, which is an interesting critter. Herrerasaurs are that little your standard teeter-totter proto-dinosaur with a long neck and a long tail. And Herrerasaurs fall into that same category. They're small, like coelophysids. They're all little itty-bitty critters. This one's weird because it's got not quite normal Saurischian pelvic structure and little tiny traces of things that remind you a little bit more of ornithischians. And that's why there's been such a dispute about that new phylogeny as to where that fits in and how sauropods fit in versus theropods and all that kind of stuff. And it's partly due to the fact that these early critters are so similar, and also that there's such a sparse record for a lot of them that you don't have a lot of data points to be able to resolve these things very, very easily. Anyway,
RJ, the other thing about the reason I'd asked was that the paper, the paper in which he describes Proto-Avis is not open access, and this was before I knew about SCIHUB, and so
various tricks, although even some of that stuff occasionally won't pop up. It was in Nature magazine, and it wasn't a technical art paper. It was just a general commentary article describing this issue of the stupid Proto-Avis. And Gish, anybody that wants to, you can go to my website, and I have the link always in the channel so you can glob onto it. Download Dinomania. That's something to give you some light reading over the New Year's holiday. I go into Dwayne Gish and the Proto-Avis case in Dinomania. That's the old chapter 3, of where he is twisting and maneuvering around the ongoing work, and he's trying to hold on to this idea that this Proto-Avis bird existed in the Triassic and therefore blows to smithereens the whole bird evolution tale. And he never discusses any of the problems that were being told about Proto-Avis that were even available in the mid-1990s when he had his last word on the subject in Evolution. The fossils still say no. That's actually his magnum opus book. That and Creation Scientists Answer Their Critics is the other biggie. Gish, where he actually doesn't answer his critics, he just maneuvers around them, and he tactfully avoids discussing an awful lot of details that he ought to have. That's this stupid little thing coming up here to start Windows updating. Stop that. Anyway, so presumably that will be Lord, I don't want to hit any buttons, otherwise the computer might go into snooze mode. So I'm suddenly got my screen covered over with something else. I hate Windows that will not do what I want them to. There it goes. Finally got rid of it. There we go. Now then. Vesta, congratulations, Jackson, on earning your BSc.
Woo!
You've
Yay.
got one science degree more than I do, which is I have none.
Well, hey, RJ, we both have one more degree than Dr. Kent Hovind does.
That's true. I have a BA in history, and Kent Hovind, the joke that I've been making currently is people have actually gotten their degrees from Dunning-Kruger Community College.
Yeah, his degree is in truthology, I bet, or something like that.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, just a walking fish. Hello there. Another friend of the show. We started a tad early because we were unsure about how the connections are going up. So a lot of the stage business has gotten out of the way. But anyway, there'll be all the links and stuff that you can get into once the show goes down. But anyway, the point about that little Proto-Avis story is that, like Piltdown Man, Proto-Avis just didn't look very helpful in figuring out bird origins. That is just the Triassic doesn't show any indications of the kinds of things that are on the verge of birdiness. Whereas you're seeing that up the yin yang now, as we can see in the Jurassic, which is the period that's coming into where Archaeopteryx is. And we know from other fossils, a lot's going on during that whole period. And so Proto-Avis has always been a weird little outlier. And the same thing that happened with Piltdown, that even before it was unequivocally determined to be a hoax, it just didn't fit in. That all the stuff they were finding about from animals in the African Australopithecines and that they were starting to be found in the 20s and 30s, and then more and more when they were discovering about what we now call Homo erectus in Asia, Java man and Peking man, and that those are the old terminology for a lot of that stuff. A big-brained orangutan strolling around the British Isles in the Pliocene just wasn't fitting into anything. And it turned out because it was a hoax. And that was the end of that for that. And that's part of the thing where you can detect things that are occasionally misinterpreted as fossils when you have fragmentary bits of things, that there's always going to be a degree of taxonomical head scratching. And then as more and more data gets settled in, some of the things that were regarded as big deal debates become irrelevant. And that's another reason why anybody that tries to lob relatively old works on such issues needs to be very careful whether there's been new work since then by the same authors as well as other people. And another area that's relevant for scholarly method is to find out whether or not there are competing camps. You can get cadres of scientists that will be defending a particular position, and it's often a controversial position. One that's popped up on the field is the Baja, BC, and geology issue I was just discussing with Jackson beforehand, which is whether there's been chunks of real estate sprinkled from British Columbia and even some bits up in Alaska and the Pacific Northwest that were originally 200 million years ago, 100 million years ago, down by Baja and Mexico, and plate movement has pulled them north. And there's a genuine debate in there. There's a cadre of scientists that are insisting that the geomagnetic data is indicating that there has been this movement, that this stuff was formed in a southern latitude. And others that disagree and that they argue that the data on the paleomagnetic stuff, that rocks, individual rocks might have been skewed a little bit so that they're creating an artificial thing. And there's a legitimate debate that's going on. Nick Zentner, the geologist from Central Washington University, tends to support that Baja BC model, and because there's a lot of other evidence for it. And my soft spot would be that I'm inclined to agree with him on it. But that's the kind of thing where you would need to know who are the camps proposing things and where their stances are and what the data field is. And there are lots and lots of areas. You'd still find some stuff about whether or not there was a boloid impact during the Younger Dryas period. There's occasionally there get papers pop up in proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and then people critical of them popping up in some other journals. You got a debate about whether or not the theory that there was a catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea took place or not. There's a genuine debate about that in geology. O'Brien says, ran into this a couple days ago. New technical papers. What that was that? I don't dare click on the bloody thing. Otherwise, I might shake up my connections here on the computer. But anyway, NCBI is a huge depository for things. Sometimes just abstracts, but often the full text. They're kind of like an HTML version of the print text. And sometimes if you then click on the PDF, you'll actually get the print version that was shown up in the actual magazine. But there's an awful lot of stuff. It's particularly in medical and science fields relating to biology. A lot of that stuff will be open access. It's less likely that it'll be open access if it's in geology and some of these other paleontological issues. That's just some of the little ups and downs. On pre-Darwinian evolution. Yeah, that I'll do a quick history lesson here that I've alluded to in other contexts and in the various books, that you have to think about what the thinkers were doing before Darwin got along the scene. Darwin didn't come out in the middle of nowhere. That they had a bunch of issues that were creeping up on them in the really around the period in the early 19th century. And part of this related to the fact that they were realizing the Earth was older than had been previously anticipated. That was one element, that they were starting to put lots of zeros in, millions. But the other thing is, by the late 18th century, and definitely by the 19th century, the terrible E word was becoming popular. And I'm not talking evolution, I'm talking extinction. That it was a big shock to people who were thinking in terms of fixed created kinds. God said everything was good, and then there was an ark, and the animals were loaded on the ark, and everything else died, and all those animals came off, and there we go. It's not like there'd be a lot of animals. I mean, there were dogs and cats and bears and bulls and all that stuff, the kind of things we find around in the barnyard. And there was no place in that mythology for millions of years of critters that aren't like anything now, going their merry little way and becoming totally extinct and having no descendants today. And so you found one group that was known because they left hard parts, and that were trilobites. So you had all these critters in the Paleozoic, the age of trilobites, of these bug-like things that lived in the seas, that left their little molted shells all over the place and are gone, totally extinct. But beyond that, all these vertebrates that they were finding as they were starting to poke around in the upper layers of the fossil record and discovering extinct elk and extinct elephants and extinct mastodons and extinct sloths, giant sloths. And when Darwin went around on his adventures with the beagle, he would look at what information they were coming up with on the geology and the paleontology. Was like, weird. There are these sloths in South America, and there are also giant sloths in fossils in South America. Oh, yeah, I wonder if there's a connection there. And that's the seeds of biogeography. And then the other thing that was really a shocker is they started finding new species. That so long as you were just looking out in the barnyard and you were seeing your goats and your cows, and there's little birds coming by, and this is all the stuff you know. And so you're going, there's something, I think, on the order of, I think it's between 100 or 1,000 or so species that are alluded to in various texts in the Bible. It's not a huge number. At any rate, as all these damned explorers went around and they kept on bringing naturalists with them to mark stuff down. So when they conquered the island from the natives, they knew what was there, and they would know what to exploit and all that kind of stuff. So the numbers started going thousands, 5,000s, 10,000, 20,000, 40,000, 80,000, 100,000, 150,000, 200,000, 300,000, 800,000, a million, million and a half. And that was living species in addition to extinct fossils, extinct fossils, extinct fossils, dinosaurs. Who the hell knew about dinosaurs? And so that period, in the period up to 1850, was just exploding this range of deep time where there had been critters living and things going extinct and stuff that's not like what it is now. And then the other question is, when did the things like now appear? It's looking like in every single instance, that's relatively recent. Occasionally you would get your living fossils. Darwin noticed those. Wow, look at this critter. And apparently it's been living here for millions and millions of years and with relatively little change. Um, Curious about that. That's an interesting little puzzle to figure out. But most of the time, it's before there were people. There was what? Well, they found these Neanderthals by the 1850s. They had very, very little information to begin with. You start getting the trope of the caveman. They were finding cave paintings, bits and pieces of things were going along. You were finding that there was like, that Louis Agassiz guy, Ice Age single initially. Then eventually it began to dawn on him, Ice Ages, and you started filling in the material. So all of this is coming along. Oh, Just Walking Fish says George Cuvier, cool dude. Yeah, he was a bit of a catastrophist. And he was living, I think he died in the early 1800s. So he spilled over. He operated out of Paris. And one thing that you can correct me, Walker, if I've misrepresented this, but I believe that Cuvier would fall in the same category as Owen and Agassiz and others who were, well, no, not Agassiz, because he'd actually did get out, but ones that were museum-based people. So people would send them specimens, and they would
I think
look at
that's right.
they weren't necessarily racing around the countryside. You get a different circumstance with somebody like Alexander von Humboldt, because he ran all over the place, although he wasn't necessarily doing a great deal of paleontology, but he certainly paid attention to geology and ecology. I'll type that into the field there. Alexander von Humboldt. Let me get my mouse over into there. He is somebody whose reputation was great at the time, but Darwin and everybody admired him. Von Humboldt, I think I'm spelling it correctly. Um, and but his reputation's only gotten better over time. That he was an amazingly perceptive analyst of things. And then, of course, you got all the different founders of modern geology. You had a lot of paleontologists knocking around. They had their own boat. The roos are smarter than they look, Brian Stevens says. Strangely, no marsupials in the Bible, Slade asked. Yes, indeed. And that's for the obvious reason that little itty bitty marsupials weren't really well known at all, even though there were small marsupials around. But of course, the famous marsupials that we find on Australia, they didn't know that was there. Not only that, by the time then you get down into the post 1960 period, when we started to work out plate tectonics and continental drift, now we have a whole new layer of paleogeography where we can look at the things that are occurring in moving time. And in fact, Jackson, we were just discussing the paleoecology of the Cambrian and these plate movements and ecology. Give us a little short summary of that, because that was just a delightful discussion we were having before the show started.
Oh, are you referring to the Lieberman paper?
Yeah.
We were talking about there's this paper by Bruce Lieberman in 2003 in which he discusses trilobites, and it's interesting for two reasons. He uses this family of trilobites to estimate the rate at which speciation is occurring during the Cambrian explosion, which against other radiation events was really not that big. I mean, in terms of speciation, but also the biogeography of trilobites about 530 million years ago is indicative of the notion that there were trilobites about 560 million years ago when the continents were in slightly different locations, which means there were trilobites, but they aren't showing up in the fossil record.
Yeah, yeah, and all of that goes back to the trying to figure out what was going on. What were there trilobites that didn't molt hard shells initially? And if so, what would they look like? And where the hell would you find evidence of them? Because they would be squishy, soft-bodied creatures that aren't very big. As I recall, the earliest trilobites aren't really huge. Some of them eventually got to be quite massive over time, and they have these unbelievably intricate spikes and stuff around them that were obviously defending against critters that would be theoretically eating them as defensive armor. And they go in a huge lineage because we're talking about hundreds of millions of years that the trilobites did their thing. And they were one of the most successful arthropod groups, and then poof, disappeared. And
Yeah.
so all of your 19th century creationists that were coming in this period, and ones who were not able to make the evolution jump, Louis Agassiz and others, they would have to be thinking what was going on. And eventually they were really forced by the data to think in terms of progressive creations. And Cuvier would think of the same kind of a thing, and Agassiz and others, that there would be like catastrophes that would, it's like an Etch-a-Sketch, that God would shake everything up, everything disappears, and they make all new things. And that is a interesting notion, but it also has a problem in terms of continuity. And we now know, because we have way more data available, that what you have in the areas where you do have a really good geological record, which is the period from the Cambrian on, you get critters developing, and they may be minor players on the scene, totally dominated by other critters. And then the ecosystem crashes in a mass extinction. That's what happened with dinosaurs. So those mammals that actually had originated at the same time as the earliest dinosaurs, but had been edged aside for 150 million years, now have the deck clear. Another reason why there are probably whales has to do with the fact that there was a mass extinction that obliterated the ecosystems, that eliminated all those marine reptiles that were eating fish. It's now fish heaven in the Tethyan Ocean as India gets closer and closer and closer to slamming into Asia. And it's maybe no coincidence that it's in that area where some artiodactyls that are really good at breathing through their nose are the ones that branch off and get a marine form that develops into the cetaceans. And plus, they got plenty of dinner out there. And although you've got sharks running around still, and sharks are extremely active. In fact, there were sharks, you get that megalodon was basically a killer whale eater that went after them. And in fact, when some of their prey disappeared in a little minor blip, we were talking about the pulses of little mini extinctions that went along. When those prey disappeared, so did the giant super sharks, because what they were specialized to eat and attack disappeared. And that's one of the reasons why you see saber-toothed critters come and go in the fossil record, because it's apparently a not terribly difficult adaptation in a mammal to develop highly specialized kinds that and tooths that can slam into a specialized critter and bring it down nicely. But if your specialized critter goes extinct, boop, you're gone, because your dinner has disappeared. And so all of these variables as to, you can imagine a divine zoo, and the Etch-a-Sketch comes along and shakes everything out and everything disappears. Why would a designer take time to refill the zoo? Why do certain critters make it through the extinction? And then there's a period where stuff that's left over dominates, like when pigs ruled the earth after the Permian extinction, the Lystrosaurus that was all over the place because it didn't have any competition. And then only after millions of years do you find new niches and new predators and new dynamic relationships. It's almost like either the designer is absent-minded and can't figure out the design all in one gush, or it's a natural evolutionary process, and it takes time and natural variations for things to go to fill the bathtub up to the same level of diversity that you found before the extinction. Oh, Restream says, congratulations, I've received 100 messages today with Restream chat. Well, la-di-da. Oh, Brian says we need John Moffat if we're talking trilobites. Yeah, if he's on Twitter, by the way, and if there's anybody that goes just gaga over trilobites constantly, it's dear John Moffat. So you can follow him on Twitter, and you'll find he'll put up postings of papers on the subject and pictures of trilobites that will blow your mind as to how weird. Plus, weird stuff like stuffed animal trilobites, or I mean, he's hilarious. He's a delightful one to follow on there. And be warned, if you are a pro-Trump person, he does not like the soon-to-be not President Trump. So there's a political edge to some of his stuff as well. So but what can one do? But nevertheless, trilobites are fun. And that's another one where, boy, a modern paleobiologist would really love to get their mitts on a living trilobite to see what its genes were. We can anticipate that it would have homeobox genes, that it would that we can anticipate probably an awful lot about its regulatory systems as an arthropod. But to know the details of it would allow you to retro-engineer and figure out what a soft-bodied trilobite might look like. But we don't have any living trilobites. So that's what's made trying to work out their relationships extremely vexing. So you get the same point with a lot of the little phyla with the miscellaneous ones in the Cambrian that ended up not going anywhere. But they had their time on the stage and did so well. Before the show started, we were dumping on Gunter Bechly because Bechly has this tendency to be incredibly vacuous and perhaps too wordy while being vacuous in his shows. And so the posting that we're putting up about the Cambrian in this one, there will be some others in the future. He's been dumping on sponges. It bothers him that there might be Precambrian sponges. And that one, I'm still plowing through the references on it because, boy, for a thing that was only about 8 or 9 pages long, it had just a vomit of technical sources on it. And so I'm just now, I think, getting up into the L's of his reference field. And some of the stuff is obscure stuff that's in Russian, and you only can get an abstract of it. Other stuff you can actually acquire. Some of it's kind of funky because as I've been going through it, you would find a particular author, and that author's been really busy on stuff that's related to that area, and yet he's only selectively citing that older paper, but not the newer ones.
Well,
You know, those are all.
I think, I don't even really have any problems with if there are no Precambrian sponges. I won't be, or I mean, sorry, if there are no fossils we have right now, which are Precambrian sponges, I'm not terribly surprised. We are talking about soft-bodied animals after all. But
Yeah, I think most of it involves the spicules that they produce. It does have a little better chance of doing so.
Right.
It's almost like the easier to spot pieces, and those are hard to deal with.
Right. But I mean, even still, even if we don't have any currently, there are fossils of actual crown metazoans in the Ediacaran, like Hautia, which is an Idarian, or we were talking about the Claudinids earlier. Dickinsonia is a bilaterian, same for Kimberella, and yet he just kind of hand waves all of these and doesn't really tell us, well, even if they are animals, what does that mean for your model? Well, he doesn't say.
And because Bechly doesn't have a model,
No.
that he's ultimately exactly as vague as Casey Luskin was, who was doing that gig for the Discovery Institute up until the time he left the Discovery Institute. And functionally, it's the same gig that Dwayne Gish was doing in the creationist context. Best to ask, are you suggesting that the designer suffered from Alzheimer's? That would explain a lot.
Well, I'd probably forget something after 130 million years too.
Yeah, so. But I don't think, or goes on vacation, or the prospect that you have more than one designer. That's the one that's absolutely anathema. I always love the Discovery Institute posts that say, we do not specify who the designer is, what the nature of the designer is. We don't say anything at all about it. Okay, well, then does that mean that there could have been like a designer for dinosaurs that's different than the designer for Ediacaran biota, and a different designer that really was really interested in like furry things and so went mammal happy
Oh,
later on.
yeah. Richard Dawkins in his book Science and the Soul talks about that, and he says that exactly. The intelligent design people say, well, we don't specify a designer, so it could have been aliens. No, wouldn't have been aliens. Could it have been multiple designers? No, we don't think it was multiple design. We think it was the Christian God.
Ooh, surprise, surprise.
So okay.
Yeah, or the Jewish Hebrew God if you're David Klinghoffer.
Yeah.
They just don't deal with that. Um, and the squishiness of it. That's the thing that's probably the most annoying about Beckley and ones that follow this argument is follow through on the logic of your own argument. If you are arguing that there is no specific indication, you're not offering any theology, you're offering just the science data, then consider the possibilities. Can you not make a perfectly legitimate argument that the Ediacaran biota that looks so different from anything that we see later on was designed by a different designer in the same way that a Mazda SUV is designed differently than a Model T Ford? They're not designed by the same people. That would explain it. And yet what you get is the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Common designer. Common design means one
Amphibious
designer.
assault vehicle.
Yeah.
Amphibious assault vehicle. That's what it
The
is.
amphibious assault vehicle. Yeah, that's Standing for Truth's latest little mantra. That that, as though there's anything in the fossil record that's kind of like that. I use the example because I'm a car buff of the 1959 luxury cars. So the 1959 Cadillac, that's the one with the god awful big fins, and then the 1959 Chrysler Imperial, which had god awful big fins, and the 1959 Lincoln Continental, which did not have fins and looked like a gigantic beach whale boat. My God, that thing was big. Anyway, they were all, we objectively know they were designed by different designers. John Najjar was the guy that did the Lincoln. Yipes, not Virgil. Well, Virgil Exner was the one that was responsible for the Chrysler, the Imperial, and then Harley Earl was the chief guru. That was some of his last ditch efforts before he retired there at General Motors. And they all have wheels, they all have doors, they all have transmissions, they all have radios, they all have paint. There's all sorts of common features to them, and yet they're objectively different designers. And we can actually objectively determine that. Well, air split your way through the Ediacaran biota and ceratopsids in the Mesozoic and Pleistocene mammals and try to tell me whether their diversity is any less than the variations between them and the those three models of cars. And another one that's standing does the trope now is that you can't deal with fossils because you don't have the genetics. You have to be able to do the genetics to be able to work out the baramins. And yet we know from Kurt Wise and Todd Wood and their baraminology work that they really avoid the genetics in their baraminology because that's data that they can't incorporate very well. So I don't know that Standing realizes the shaky diving board that he's sticking out into the pool without noticing there's no water underneath.
Yeah.
Oh boy. Anyway, so yes, nice to see Just a Walking Fish. I will give a thumbs up to you and Dan, who did a delicious discussion of the latest creationist tome, Robert Carter and his stuff on genetics that was just being posted up and at Answers in Genesis, or no, Creation Ministries International. I was hoping that there would be some people with particular genetic integration. Oh, aren't Mazda cars created by an Aztec god, Slade? Oh, you little scamp. Yeah, although it does have the Z in there, the Mazdas are a Japanese car that for a while was owned by Ford, by the way. And then they, so there was, and also they have some of the best style automobiles. They have a really good design team there at Mazda. it's so easy. It's like a cat with a laser pointer. You bring up a side topic with me, and I'm just off on the little side materials. But it is a useful thing because it was used, the Barra's blunder, as it's called, by Philip Jeanson, of using
Oh.
Corvettes as an analogy for how you can distinguish changes in design elements in there. It's still a valid point is to deal with how cladistics can deal with stuff. Cladistics can theoretically sort out any object, but they won't find nested hierarchies.
That I hate that stupid Barra's blunder thing so much because you said it was Johnson, right?
Yeah,
because he was misrepresenting what Barra was saying.
yeah.
Because Barra it was talking about how not that cars weren't designed. He was talking about how you have very slight incremental changes among like 53, 54, 55 forward or whatever.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the fossil record of fossil hominins, look at Australopithecines, you have very slight changes as you go. And he's like, and then Johnson was like, oh, well, look, he mentions a designed object. Yeah, it's called an analogy. Do you not know how analogy
it really was an analogy about how you discern transitions and changes in over time in the fossil record. Because if some of the features are so diagnostic, just as there are features, teeth and particular pelvic shapes and things that are distinctive of particular animals, and that's why they can be assigned to particular families or even down to genuses, genera in some cases. It's the very same thing that you show me the tail fin of a 58 Cadillac, just the part with the tail lights in it, and I can tell you right off the bat that is a 1959 Cadillac. It is absolutely unique. There's not a single automobile on Earth that ever looked like that. And so you could have this tiny fragment of fin with the tail lights sticking out, those little double lights, and it would instantly allow to tell you that you have a piece of a 1959 Cadillac, not a 1958 Cadillac, not a 1949 Ford, not a 1972 Chrysler. It is nothing else but specifically a 1959 Cadillac. And it's understandable that people like Johnson, who was a lawyer, and others that are 900 miles away from paleontology and how to identify things. It isn't even unique to that. It's not even, I use in the Troubles in Paradise chapter, I use tarot cards and playing cards as an example of how you can use systematics and see how various things over time. Same thing goes with music, that you hear a piece of music with certain kinds of harmonic chords in them, and you can go, wait a minute, that's probably written in the 1850s through 1880s, maybe. And if it turns out to be somebody that's writing in an old-fashioned style later on, my favorite would be Johannes Brahms's piano quartet, which Arnold Schoenberg decided to orchestrate in 1939. And I first heard it without hearing it in any other context. And it sounds like this gigantic Wagnerian symphony, and it's got xylophones and all this stuff in it. It was driving me nuts because so much of it sounded like Brahms, but yet it didn't have the orchestral palette that Brahms would have been using. Well, it turned out because he's writing in 1939 for a modern orchestra, but he didn't change a single note. And there are harmonies in that Brahms that are like Richard Strauss. Brahms wrote them in 1850. So it's a moment of time slice that you can deal with these kinds of things. So it's not a process that's unique to paleontology. It's a thing that you use in historical analysis when people are digging through stuff. Even idiot Kent Hovind understands this in principle, because he knows that if you find an 1852 coin in the buried chest, that thing must date at least to 1852. It could date much later than that because it could be an old coin, but it can't be from 1750 if it's got an 1852 coin in it.
I want to point out, Slade says, no, they don't understand analogies. And I think that's very accurate. That's why when I'm talking with creationists, I try never to use analogies because they just functionally don't understand how analogies work, and so I just avoid them completely. I tried.
When you use an analogy with them, then look up because it's the contrail way over the head, and they're going to completely miss it.
Well, they get focused on like the details of the analogy, and they're like, "Well, this analogy is wrong." It's like, well, it's not an explanation; it's an analogy. It's supposed to be like the thing you're explaining, but not quite the same. So,
a perfectly fine example that's currently going on in this endless ping pong match that's been going on in email with Nephilim Free and Erica and others is the genetic code a strict code that means it must have been designed because only minds do codes, and it goes just around and around and around the mulberry bush on that. And whenever you attempt to try to drag them in to the physical nature of what goes on during codon assignments and transfer RNA and ribosome functions and the role of RNA in the ribosome and blah, blah, blah. Boy, they just want to go back to the thing. Vesta said, David, whoops, I'm looking up through the line. There was an earlier question about whether or not there was contingency. Conway's a point in how much the things would occur convergently. There's a great deal of attraction in some of the arguments that Conway Morris makes on these issues. I think the idea that multicellularity pops up so often and in so many weird ways in organisms that it's probably kind of inevitable. But whether or not we get multicellular organisms that can make toast with jam, now that's a much more specific kind of a thing. Just a Walking Fish says that the creationists don't get the analogies and it's the and transitional forms and other things. There are a series of blind spots that I've noticed in studying creationism going back for decades.
Gigantic blind spots.
Ginormous. And one of them is what I call the map of time. They just can't wrap their heads around the chronology. And it doesn't matter whether the younger creationists or older creationists or intelligent design, as Bechly shows in that, they just have a problem thinking chronologically. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, to anchor their argument in time space. And then when it comes to figuring out how to apply speciation and working out what transitional forms would look like, that's an absolute blind spot. You ask any creationist, okay, you don't like transitional X, tell us what you would need to see for you to go, well, now that would be a transitional, and please tell us how it looks different from X. You'll never get them to do that. It's the brain just whoop, and they're off in another little cloud on that. But a God that claims to make everyone individually wouldn't need a code anyway. Well, you have the fact that you have living organisms that lives in populations. However, you've got a layer of things, because what you need to have interchangeable, and assuming, of course, that God is okay with animals eating one another and all that, which brings up the whole notion of carnivory and whether or not that's supposedly anti-biblical and blah, 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 due to sin and fall of man and all that stuff. You don't tend to find that argument with Fazal Rana's old Earth creationists. They're kind of okay with the death thing. Anyway, if you've got an organism that can deal with the things with the protein so that it eats the critter and it digests the proteins, all you need to do is to make a compatible set of proteins. Well, what code you use to create the proteins, that the protein is dictated by the amino acids. How you decide which codon triplets associate with a particular amino acid, let's say serine, if it's totally arbitrary in the genetic code, because codes are arbitrary. The symbol A to mean the sound A, or H to mean H, but yet in Cyrillic, it's the letter N, what we call N. All of those are arbitrary symbols. The use of 0 and 1, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and A through Z, all of those are absolutely arbitrary symbols, and you could use anything you like, and you could use base 6 or base 802 or whatever you like. It's utterly arbitrary. However, if it is arbitrary that those codon assignments are, as we pointed that out in the Rocks Were There book, oops, ding, 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 which you'll want to get. There are so many permutation combinations of amino acids because there's only 20 amino acids and 64 codons. And there are so many permutations that you could do. You could literally give every created kind its own proprietary genetic code. Easy, easy peasy. Because they're talking only 1,500 created kinds in the Ark Encounter model. That's a no. You even if there were millions, even if every bloody species were its own created kind, you theoretically could give them all their proprietary code, to where you would have, like, say, ACG coding for whatever amino acid you jolly well wanted, and those permutations give you that much options. That's not what we find. Instead, we find a highly regularized coding system that is almost universal. And it's almost universal in that every organism uses them, with the exception of some mitochondria and some bacteria that have modified some of the spare codons to code for something else. Never the weird numbers of ones. There are two or three amino acids that are coded for by only a single codon triplet. No variations to them, no redundant ones, no extra ones. So theoretically, if you wanted to have that codon used to code for something else, you'd have to use a different codon to code for that amino acid. There are no examples of that in nature. Why? Because they would be missing that amino acid. Nature can't get to that. A code designer could get to that, easy peasy, but a living biological system can't do that.
Easy peasy Myers.
Easy peasy Myers. Yes, there we go. Brian Stevens said with 20 and 64, you can give every living thing its own. And it's even more than 20, because there are actually 22 amino acids. There's two more that are cysteine and another one that I've forgotten about. But anyway, that have their own little specialized codings. The weirdest thing to me is the fact that I think it's the stop codon and tryptophan that share the same codon.
AUG?
Yeah, something like that. It's one of those.
No, that's methionine. That's the start. Never mind.
And anyway, we have a nice appendix on that whole issue. And in this back and forth that went on about the coding system, I actually quoted a segment from that chapter on the fact that people have been investigating the reasons why those particular amino acid associations have occurred and how that's evolved. And we're peeling back to try to figure out what the earlier system was. So were there always 20 amino acids used by life? That's used by Luca, but that's maybe 100 million years or more after the origin of life. There may have been fewer ones, and it is revealing that the amino acids that are the easiest to synthesize prebiotically are the ones that are most commonly used in proteins. And that if you look at the ones that were like the precursor set, let's say we had a system that had only 2 codons instead of 3. That can only code for a smaller number, 8, of amino acids. And so there, it turns out that those amino acid things are the cores for almost all the proteins. So the suspicion is that there could have been a training wheel set, that the system we see now with triplet codons, with 64 codons instead of fewer, and that have that wobbly third codon and are encoding for a full complement of 22 amino acids and the 20 for the standard ones, that wasn't necessarily the original system. It's the system by the time you get to Luca, not necessarily what the precursor was. And then before that, single, where individual nucleotides are having connections for some reason to particular amino acids in that prebiotic environment. And so it's turning out things like uracil and others are having unusual properties that they're discovering of what they do in a prebiotic chemical thing as to what they turn into and what they connect up with. And it's not easy work to figure out. You don't have any of the precursor things in the existing world. Everything has changed over. You've got billions of years. It's like trying to figure out what's underneath Ellensburg, Washington, without drilling, when it's covered over with a gigantic thick layer of Columbia basalt, and it's obscuring the thing. We don't know how many training wheel living systems developed in the early stages of life in that origins or bust period, and whether some of them, like trilobites, could have had a pretty good haul for quite a long time, but are invisible completely because we have no way of seeing them in the fossil record, and eventually outcompeted by the later ones. Jump in.
I want to point out the Walking Fish said 20 and 64. What's the math on that? That 64 is 4 times 4 times 4, and then only 20 or 22 of those are actually used.
Yeah, So by definition, you've got a redundancy factor. And now, if you were a purely logical designer, I like that thing. One of the light bulb moments in our biocodon assignments for me was learning the duplex codon hypothesis, the duplex, is that you can theoretically start working through all of these issues experimentally. It's not easy to do, but the scientists are actually doing that, and none of the creationists are. If anybody ever does crack the origin of life, we can be absolutely certain that it's never going to be any creationist. But if you think about 64 codons, and you've only got 20 amino acids to play with, or 22, well, one way would be 3 codons per triplets per amino acid. There's 60. And then you could have 2 multiply redundant stop codons and 2 multiply redundant start codons. Simple peasy. Or a single start and stop and use the extra ones for the extra amino acids. See how simple all that is? If it was logically designed. Instead, we get a bunch of them that have 6 codon triplet sets, and some that have 4, and some that have 3, and some that have 2, and some that have 1. Is it just willy-nilly? Creationists have to argue it's designed, but why is it so oddly designed? And so then they have to kind of back off. There must be a really good designy reason for it. But they can never permit the possibility that the reason why it looks the way it is because it's a naturally evolved system and it's got clunky, weird stuff. David at Jackson Wheaton, I have some information for you that you might be interested in. Oh, well, always fire away. You can launch us email. You got our email and stuff that we are always interested in this stuff. And if it's really interesting, make it public. Do a video on it and all the rest, because that's the thing, is that share and share alike. The thing that I was talking with Jackson earlier about that proto-avis matter is that the time that gets saved when you don't have to reinvent the wheel, when you don't have to do all of that research yourself. That's why there's things like Talk Origins Archive and various others. Well, it's tough when you're dealing with cutting edge research. I've got something on the order of 2,000 technical journals that are ones that have been the resources in my reference bibliography. There ain't no way in hell that I am reading every current issue of thousands of technical journals. It ain't possible. There's not enough time. So everybody has to triage. So if somebody that's really knowledgeable on a field can do a lot of the work ahead of you, you can share that knowledge. That's why listening to Erica on hominids or biology, my gosh, I am unworthy when it comes to Jackson and his rattling off taxa names. Holy shit, you're good at that. And I am nowhere near. I have to write it down and memorize the thing and keep the note, because I can't keep track of that stuff in the way that you do as just an effortless skill. Well, everybody has these little techniques that they can make use of. And the more that you can share that information, the more you can be ahead of the game, so that when you do encounter creationists, you can have which anvil do I want? Oh, that one over there. Now that's just the right size anvil. This is all about that particular topic that we all have worked out. Okay, come over. You have to move over just a little farther. There it is. Look up, plop. And that's the way that the discussion should be done, to where you're confident of your argument and you can make solid arguments that aren't. The worst you can do is like, well, I don't know about that. Yeah, so you say, maybe not, or, you're just being, and at that point, you just lost the argument. Whereas when you can deal with things, as I was doing or trying to do with Mr. Batman on that creation and dinosaur debate, to where I was hoping at some point we could really start discussing dinosaurs, but he knew so little about the subject.
Well, that was just like your debate with Standing on the same topic, where he also never talked about dinosaurs.
Yeah. Or worse, he was so reluctant to offer his source when he was putting up these little slides, and I'm saying, where are you getting these from? Well, I got them from a book. Finally, I got into it. Well, what book? Well, it's this Nance book. Well, do you have it? Well, yeah. Well, bring it in. Let's talk about it.
Yeah,
And
Vance
so,
Nelson, another young Earth creationist.
and the next bit of the show was a source analysis of the Vance book, and holy moly, he really shouldn't have relied on that.
No, I mean, yeah, Vance Nelson is the guy who has like the jade Montana ceratops or whatever that he claims was made is it by Native Americans or something like that. And it's like he's the only person with this object, and like no one can look at it except him. So
yeah, and so that area there, you get exactly the same phenomenon spilling over into other areas. I'll give a brief politics alert. Politics alert. We have a numbskull right-wing nutball Republican who ran for governor here and lost spectacularly. Yeah, he got the Republican nomination. He was an extreme conspiracy theory oddball. Anyway, he refuses to concede. And he's been insisting that there was vote fraud here in Washington State. We have an all voting system, and stop this idiot thing. I want that not to happen. Do not stop the computer automatically.
My state, unfortunately, was red.
Yeah. Well, we have the eastern side of the state's much more conservative than the west. I think Morris Rogers always wins by 60,000 votes. This has been the case for years and years and years. But the point is that this guy has been haranguing the relatively conservative mayor of Spokane, insisting that there was vote fraud here in Spokane. And so she says, okay, bring up the evidence that you have of this. And they refuse to do it. So here they're claiming that she should accept their evidence of fraud, which they refuse to present, so that she can look to see what the evidence of fraud is. What's wrong with this picture?
Oh, that's and that's what happened all across the country. Was it the Pennsylvania judge who wrote that scathing conclusion? Who said you're asking for like hundreds of thousands of votes to be tossed out, and you have brought literally zero evidence to show that voter fraud was occurred.
And this is functionally the same bad method that we're seeing with Vance Nelson or Jeanson or Standing for Truth or any of the others. It's on a different data field, but it's the same bit of where they have approved sources that are non-negotiably true and never fact-checked, where they're missing huge swaths of data field. The only reason it gets into a new area because it hits into the courts, where the standard reaction in the courts, including from Trump appointments, is
yeah, exactly. It's so funny because now he's been turning against the people he appointed, who are now saying there's no evidence.
Yeah. He was the governor of Georgia, who has been a sycophant of Trump all the way down the road, and he won't lie through his teeth for Trump, suddenly becomes this terrible, scurrilous disgrace. I mean, that shows you this personality cult that's been built up, and it's one of the reasons why ever since Trump began to run for presidency, I've been telling people, oh, this is not a nice person and is going to make life dismal. I'll be putting a link up on Twitter on the thing. There was just a recent post from a poll that NPR did with a polling group that's got some scary numbers. 17% of the nation is really okay with QAnon conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
And higher when you move over into the Republican Party. And these are worrisome numbers, but they're real. So we have to deal with them. And this is basically the whole Trumpista period has pulled the lid off of that culture camp conservative network that creationism is the tip of the iceberg of. And now we're seeing what it does when they have their mitts on governance. And it ain't pretty. And it's actually dangerous. COVID.
Absolutely. I saw Standing was there briefly. I do want to say, Standing, if you're still in the side chat, if you're still listening, I sent you an email several weeks ago, probably well over a month now, and I never received an email. So if you ever want to chat again, if you're ever down to have a
Ooh,
Nice
Ken
chat.
Hovind's employee says my parents are QAnon followers. My condolences.
Yeah, it's QAnon is it's these are the people who were saying the COVID-19 will be over once the election occurs. This is just
Yeah.
a power. Freaking what's his name? Alex Jones was promoting that.
Well,
That
Mike
this is
Pence was saying the same thing,
it's just
and
a power
you
struggle, right?
yeah,
And
you get the whole well, not only that, that there's a satanic pedophile ring that's rampant. That's also part of the thing. It's the same stuff that led to Pizzagate, and that idiot went in there and tried to shoot up the pizza parlor because he wanted to rescue the kids in the basement of a pizza parlor that has no basement.
yeah, that's yeah, it's pretty insane that I mean, these people are just nuts. Or the people who are coming up with these things are just nuts. They're tying together, you know, things that are entirely unrelated to each other. They're drawing all
Yeah.
sorts of imaginary lines, and then they, okay, that's fine. But
Oh
you
yeah,
know,
Standing is still in the live feed. Hello, Standing. Have you got your monograph done yet?
I mean, like I said, we had a couple very cordial chats, so I've no problem talking to you. But yeah, no, the people who come up with these ideas are absolutely just bat guano crazy, and the people who believe them are
Yeah.
not themselves crazy. I think they just don't do any research. They hear it and then they're like, "Well, it must be
Yeah.
true. Someone said
Well,
it."
yeah, and that's why the study of things, the extreme weird things that are relatively niche markets like flat Earth, much bigger niche areas like geocentrism, much bigger niche areas like creationism, and this then now intersects with climate science denialism, anti-vaxxers. Uh, uh, Gee, we should do a book on some of these topics in future, Jackson.
Yeah, standing. Would that happen to be the monograph, which has like random segments which are teal and has URLs in a book? Is that the
Yeah.
monograph? Because if it is, you may want to rethink your formatting.
Yeah, from the material that I've seen when Erica has been
Oh,
going through some of this stuff, it's hilarious.
but also, Walker, yeah, feel better soon. Gosh, Walker is not feeling too well. So
Oh, yeah, chicken soup or whatever it is, and keep out of stuff and away from troubles and all of that. I'm impervious to bacteria and viruses, so it's not a problem for me. I talk them to death.
okay,
So they,
please don't play chicken with viruses, please.
yeah, I like Trump have a powerful immune system. At any rate, but, you find the fact that Louisiana representative just dropped dead, 41 years old, the newly elected one. He's never going to get into Congress. He died of COVID.
Yeah,
You know,
he
it can,
from what I understand, he was not downplaying the effects of COVID, so he's not like Mike Pence and
mm,
Donald Trump, but he was attending rallies where they did not make people wear masks.
yeah.
So
And judging from the number of people that have been traveling for Christmas, there's going to be yet more surges as all of that stuff kicks through into the new year. So January is going to still be mucky. My niece was just heart-stricken that they have a friend of the family just got out of the Navy, 27 years old, and he died of COVID.
oh man.
His whole life was ahead of him. When I think that I had done nothing by the time I was 27, it would be decades before I would really start doing the kinds of things that I would be doing in terms of learning and writing books and all these kinds of things that I've been doing. And so here's that whole kid's life potentially there, as well as
Yeah.
potential families and all of that that he could have, but gone. So the notion that this is just an illness that affects old people is just not true.
Yeah, no,
It's
that's
a case by
terrible.
case thing. And we still have a solid worry about people who get over COVID but still have all sorts of health problems because it can do stuff down in the lungs and all sorts of things that can make breathing difficult and so it's not a walk in the park. And the idea that as a public health issue, that there would be people who have been so oblivious to call it a hoax and
Right.
to refuse. We have a whole bunch of them over in Idaho. Idaho has been a COVID denialist theme park for quite a while. And they would even advertise, hey, Washington State's requiring you to wear masks at things and not go to restaurants. Come over to Post Falls. We're open. Well, yipes. And some of them have been spilling back across the border. And we've had outbreaks here in our hospitals here because we're a major medical center for the region. They'll have to come over here for some of the hospital beds. So it's just Looney Tunes. Bad method usually doesn't kill you unless the bad method people get in charge of governments. In which case, the odds of having bad stuff happen rises radically. So that's why all this methods issue is not a trivial detail on there. So we've had a pretty good, darn good old show on here. Let me see if I can call up my Rocks Were There advert here to end the show on.
Let's see I would love to be here more often to be on the show and whatnot, but sadly I have work most nights, and so
you have definitely been missed. I think it's wonderful because if we're going to be rambling all over Hell's Half Acre, it's nice to have that kind of feedback. Let me put up a little share screen. There we go. Let's put up the commercial, and we can talk over that since the sound doesn't show up on the live feed. But anyway, we can point out that this is our wonderful book that we wrote together, and we are immensely proud of it. Wait a minute. Let me see. Whoop, there we go. Come on. Yeah. And there will be a volume 2. We've got solid research. It's funny. It's current, up to date. And I think it's a lit addition to the technical literature here, because anybody that's operating at a college level will find oodles of rigorous science material. A lot of stuff. Steve Bauman, supporter of the project here. Patreon. I'm particularly pleased with the title. I think the Rocks Are There. I don't think we could have picked a more appropriate title, given the fact that Answers in Genesis has been such a player of that. Well, were you there when X happened? And we can be quite unequivocal that the rocks were there when Tiktaalik was around. The rocks were there when the Cambrian explosion was happening. The rocks were there. They've got the witnesses for us, and they certainly don't lie in the way that many creationists do. Anyway, Corroborando says it has it on Kindle. Yes, and we'll always make that available. It's a little easier doing ebook versions of stuff through the Amazon CreateSpace, because you can just generate it off of the word processor document, and there are other formats. Nook, for example, is just a pain in the ass to get.
Can I make one more comment, RJ?
Yeah, absolutely.
Understanding regarding the URL thing that I said, you're listed as one of the authors of 100 plus falsifications of evolutionism, which has hyperlinks and URLs in the book.
In a book. Yeah, theoretically, I suppose that might work on a Kindle, but a print version of it, that's meaningless.
Right there. You hold on. See, you are the author. Oops, you are the author. Standing for truth. And it says,
Is it possible Standing has short-term memory problems on this?
Right there in your book, there's a URL. You have URLs in your book, Standing. That's what I was referring to.
I don't think there's a bibliography in it, is there?
I don't know. This is from Colton. Just sent me this.
Yeah. By the way, I would recommend, dear Standing, that if you do books, that you get to the big league and make sure that there is a full reference bibliography and a proper index, so that people can find the information, assuming you are actually including information. But it can make it a lot easier to be able to analyze stuff. Not that it's impossible to, as I have been demonstrating over the weeks as I go through this, and prior to that, Rupin Sanford's book, to show that nothing can escape the maw of sound method, that you can look at what it's cited and what isn't, and you can follow through on the bit of whether an argument actually makes a good case or not. And if it's suppressing information and misrepresenting primary source material, I contend that is an indication that they have their head up their ass and should not be relied on as a reliable source. So I think we've killed off quite a while here. This has been a pretty good long show. It's been because we started early on that. We kept up the signal. It didn't crash. So hope to have you on future weeks. At the very least, if you're not here, Jackson, you will be here in spirit. I will be concluding the show. And have everybody stay safe. Have a wonderful, happy new year. Drink yourself silly if you're in that mood. Stay clear of the hideous virus and see into 2021, which we want to be better in 2020.